Lugia VSTAR, one of the most powerful Pokemon TCG decks, and today I'm going to explain to you the entire guide of the two choices you can make with Lugia VSTAR, why it's so powerful, what its matchup spread looks like, and how you can be a Lugia VSTAR expert yourself. If you enjoy this kind of competitive content, please like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Lugia VSTAR is comprised of two integral parts of the deck. Lugia VSTAR is your main Pokemon that has the attack Tempest Dive for 4 colorless energies that does 220 damage and discards a stadium in play. A very steep requirement, but it does have a very cool V-Star power in the form of Summoning Star. During your turn, you may put up to 2 colorless Pokemon that don't have a rule box from your discard pile onto your bench. Pokemon V, GX, etc. have rule boxes. So, with 2 retreat and a lightning type weakness, Lugia VSTAR has 280 HP and is a Stage 1 Pokemon. Lugia couples very well with Archeops, Lug, and Chops as many like to call it. Archeops is a Stage 2 prehistoric fossil Pokemon with 150 HP, but has one of the most powerful abilities in the current Pokemon TCG standard format, Primal Turbo. Once during your turn, you may search your deck for up to 2 special energy cards and attach them to one of your Pokemon, then shuffle your deck. That ability itself has been incredibly powerful since its release, and even after the Pokemon TCG rotation that happened in April, we still have many powerful special energy to be used alongside this card. It has an attack for 3 energies, Speedwing for 120, and has 1 retreat cost. This is a skeleton for the Lugia V-Star list. A skeleton basically means that these cards are pretty much going to make it into the deck no matter which path you pick. Whether you pick the colorless path or you pick the single strike path, these cards are more than likely to make it into your deck. 4-3 Lugia V-Star is pretty staple across the board. Some lists play a 4th copy of the V-Star just to ensure that you get there, but a lot of the time you don't really need more than 1 V-Star in play. 4 copies of Archeops because that's the main guy you need to get into your discard so you can use Summoning Star. 2 copies of Luminion because almost always you need 2 Luminion for a copy of Professor Burnett to start playing the game, and the second Luminion is a game closer or just lets you play the game the way you want to. Pumpkaboo with its Pumpkin Pit ability allows you to bump a stadium card out of play, and this can be very crucial against cards like Path to the Peak. There's heavy copies of Professor's Research, Boss's Orders, and Iono, being primarily the only supporters outside of a Professor Burnett that can get 2 Archeops into the discard immediately. 4 Ultra Ball, 4 Aroma, and 2 Nest Ball usually make their way into the lists as consistency cards, and some lists opt to play a heavier consistency cards than just these in forms like Mesagoza. Mesagoza and Collapsed are 2 of the stadiums of choice for both of these lists if the colorless version chooses not to play Path. Mesagoza lets you flip a coin and get any Pokemon if heads, and Collapsed lets you limit your bench to 4, discarding things like a Luminion that might cause you some trouble if it's there. Double Turbo Energy, V-Guard Energy, and Gift Energy make their way into all of these lists, with Double Turbo fulfilling 2 of the 4 required energy costs for any colorless attacker or any attacker that uses colorless energy, V-Guard providing not only a colorless energy requirement, but also 30 less damage taken by V cards, which gives you some perfect numbers in a lot of situations. Gift Energy is one of your most powerful cards because when this Pokemon gets knocked out by damage, you can fill your hand up to 7 before starting your turn, which means that late game Ionos and Judges and things that would disrupt you otherwise can be absolutely non-effective. Here is how you choose your own adventure. The single strike version allows you to have cards like Dark type attackers in the form of Tyranitar V and Yveltal. These cards are very good against decks like Gardevoir and Mew VMAX, but then so give you some versatility. You also have access to fighting type attackers in the form of Single Strike Urshifu VMAX and Stone Journer, which gives you a slightly better matchup into things like Miraidon or even the Mirror Match, where your Urshifu can come in and do a ton of damage. Single Strike Urshifu VMAX's main ability or usability was against Duraludon VMAX, which is no longer in play. These decks, the Single Strike version has big knockout potential, with Single Strike energies adding plus 20 damage to all of your attacks, and attacks like Tyranitar V doing 240 off the bat, adding 80 damage potentially with 4 Single Strike energies, and Single Strike Urshifu doing something similar. You have big knockout potential, but you have to play cards like Urn of Vitality that kind of clog up those hands and eat up space sometimes that you don't want to see. It eats up consistency. Urn of Vitality lets you recycle these attackers and keep the game going. You have to play cards like Radiant Serena simply to heal your Pokemon because you are playing way more 2-prizers and the trade is not as favorable in a lot of flowcharts. The colorless version can play cards like Path to the Peak and disrupt your opponents because you don't necessarily need any abilities past your early Summoning Star. You play heavier cards of heavier copies of cards like Jet Energy and Therapeutic Energy to kind of have your Pokemon be more effective. You play heavier copies of Snorlax, which does 180 damage, which can hit a lot of Pokemon very effectively as a one-prizer. Wordier V is your big one-shot option towards the end of the game that can utilize all the energy on your board to just wrap out a game. You have to play cards like Drapion V or your Mew matchup, and for better or for worse, your Gardevoir matchup also suffers significantly. So playing these two cards allows you to kind of have an edge in those matchups, and unlike the single strike version that has to trade 2 for 2s, you can trade 1 for 1s against Gardevoir while always taking the first prize, because you are the first attacking deck almost always. The Fear Factor. These cards are cards that really give Lugia a run for its money a little bit. You're a little bit afraid if you sit across the table from them. Most notably, Miraidon EX, a lightning-type deck completely through and through, allows it to use any lightning-type attackers like Raichu V, like Raikou V, cards like these that can prove a lot of problems. They can definitely damage you in ways that you don't want. And it's a very fast deck on top of that. So against a deck like Miraidon EX, you're almost always giving up the first 2 prizes, which then in turn puts you in a negative spot for the rest of the game. Cards like Temple of Sinnoh making their way into decks like Gardevoir can also be a very negative effect, because if they can use Temple of Sinnoh and Iono on a very crucial turn to negate your gift energy, you're left on the following turn scrambling to knock out their Gardevoir, but also bump the stadium and use those energies that you have effectively. This can really be the big change, the swing turn or the swing factor in a lot of matchups, so Temple of Sinnoh is one of those cards that we really do not like to see. Path to the Peak is also one of those final cards that is kind of a problem card to see, but mostly only on the first 2 turns. In the first 2 turns, Path to the Peak is there to inhibit your setup, either by using Luminion or stopping your Lugia from using Summoning Star. If they can stop you from using Summoning Star for even 1 extra turn, then the game gets a lot harder for most decks. But Lugia, if they can bump the Path to the Peak and actually play the game, is one of those decks that can always put themselves in a position where they can be ahead. Here is a single strike list that I took to top 8 A regionals with almost 2,000 Masters players. The list is single strike. You've got 2 copies of Tyranitar and a copy of Yveltal. Now these 3 choice of attackers are that Tyranitar is one of the most powerful attackers in the deck with a single strike crush attack, which can one-shot pretty much everything in the format, and Cragalanche gives you good odds against decks like Lost Box. Adding in Yveltal for the Gardevoir and Mew matchups is just an insurance policy to make sure you have 3 different Dark-type attackers to close out the game. Stonejourner makes its way into the list to deal with Lightning-type attackers, as well as being a 1-prize attacker that can swing pretty favorably into decks like Lost Box. 130 HP is also very good because Cramorant Spit Innocently cannot beat through it. That being said, the deck also played Penny this weekend in an effort to deal with those Lost Box decks and recover some of your energy here and there. Besides that, it's a pretty straightforward list. I don't think there's anything too special about Single Strike to say. You can look down the list and see a lot of 4-ofs and a couple of 1-ofs here and there, but the 4-ofs are more appealing. Colorless Lugia is the other version. This is a list that just got top 4 or second place at the Yokohama Champions League with 3,200 Masters. This deck there's a couple of cards in here that aren't really released just yet, but you can supplement them for the time being. The Mew EX can become a Wordier, for example. This deck plays 2 copies of Thumping Snorlax, should be 3 in my opinion, that do a ton of damage and can wake back up with the Therapeutic Energy. You have Luxray to deal with mirror matches potentially, and using a reversal energy that can be pulled out of the deck. It's very easy to set this guy up. You have Mew EX with Free Retreat and Instruct that lets you draw up to a full hand of 3, and also can copy the opposing attack. Usually Mew EX would be replaced by Wordier in most spots, and I don't know if it's correct to play both or just one in the future. This list is playing cards like Great Ball over Nest Ball, but Nest Ball is still very strong in that slot. Zinnia's Resolve makes its way into this list to draw and see more cards, and traditionally we would see more Path to the Peak in this list, but this version opted not to play it. There are 4 Double Turbo and 4 Jet Energy most notably, giving us a lot more energy to work with for our colorless attackers that can utilize these Double Turbo energies very, very efficiently. Now we're going to go right into the matchups. Lost Box Kyogre is just won the Pittsburgh Regional Championship, and I think it is one of those matchups that's slightly favorable for Lugia. You can kind of heal your deck, heal your attackers as you like to choose. You can Iono them in a timely manner, and you want to kind of use your Cragalanche effectively to put your opponent's resources in the discard. Cragalanche also serves a dual purpose because the attacker Tyranitar has 230 HP, and with the V-Guard energy, Dragonite can't one-shot this Pokemon. So they have to go into a Sableye or attack with a Cram early on, and if they do that, I think Lost Box is effectively wasting an attack. And if they have to cram into something like a T-Char or a Lugia V, you can always use Penny to pick it right back up and keep the game going. If these kinds of decks like Kyogre use things like Raikou too early or Dragonite too early, you can take those 2 prizes without any sweat, and all of a sudden the clock is put on them. Now, this list played 1 copy of Roxanne, but most typically Kyogre lists don't play any hand disruption, so you are at no risk of your hand being disrupted, and you can just kind of pound through the matchup. Should be an overall favorable matchup for both Lugia decks, and that's kind of how you play it. Lost Box Turbo is a little bit scarier because they can accelerate to their 10 much quicker, get the Sableye much quicker, and they want to Greninja your Archeopsis early and then take them out with Sableye. Now the counter to that is just set up your attackers nice and early and get ready to rumble, basically. Raikou is also a threat in many facets of the game because Raikou is one of the few things that can one-shot a Lugia VSTAR with its lightning type weakness, but once again Dragonite can't really pound through the likes of Tyranitar. So your Tyranitar and Lugia will effectively carry the game for you, and the Tyranitar with its Craglanche attack will usually put yourself in a good position. In both these matchups, you will take early prizes, and they will also take prizes back at you, but you have to keep those Ionos nice and comfy to go ahead and disrupt these attackers and put them in low hand sizes and awkward positions when they're playing the game. Lost Tina has become a lot more popular in recent time, and it's one of the few decks that's a little bit scary with its multiple copies of Path to the Peak that they can play on early turns to disrupt you. While Lost Tina necessarily isn't the strongest deck, and they have to use attacks like Abyss Seeking to get ahead on the Lost Zone, they can kind of take their time with their Jet Energies in the Path to the Peak if it even sticks for 1 turn. If the Path to the Peak actually ends up sticking, they're one of the few decks that can also use attacks like Star Requiem to simply one-shot your Lugia V-Star without having to expend resources. And the following attack, Lost Impact, deals with Tyranitar pretty well. So 1 Giratina V-Star effectively can take 4 prizes, so Lugia's main goal is to try to boss up a Giratina V while it is still a V and take it out for 220 damage. That being said, this deck also plays Roxanne Iono, so you have to be very cognizant of the fact that your hand will get limited pretty quickly. Still a slightly favorable matchup for Lugia, but just making sure that you can deal with that Path to the Peak is the most crucial part of the matchup. Next up, we have Miraidon. Probably one of the worst matchups for Lugia to sit across the table from, because you can always use those electric generators in the early game to power up the Raikou V and take a one-shot on Lugia V, and Miraidon EX's Photon Blaster for 220, plus Zapdos's Lightning Symbol for an extra 10 damage can pound through a Tyranitar V. So these are all attackers that really make this matchup difficult, but the most crucial and annoying card in the matchup is Bravery Charm. Bravery Charm gives a Pokemon 50 HP, which means that Raikou can no longer be one-shot by your Lugia, making it so you have to use a Stone Journer or you have to use a Tyranitar in those situations. And a lot of the time you have to use a Lugia to take the first knockout just because you can't expend those resources to put down another attacker. The flowchart, if everything goes ideally, is that Miraidon will take the first 2 prizes, you take 2 prizes on Raikou, they take 2 prizes back on your Lugia, you attack with the Stone Journer to take 2 prizes, and also use Iono on the same turn, putting them at a low hand size. If they're able to produce another attacker, this is where you have to set up something like a T-Tar to close out the game. And a lot of the time, you will be the one who wins the game, and often if you prize something important or you just don't draw the best cards off of your gift off of Stone Journer in that situation, you could lose the game potentially. Definitely a rough matchup, but one that is winnable. Mew VMAX is a very popular deck coming off a win at the World Championships. This list has gone lower and lower on their path counts, which makes the matchup a little bit more bearable, but the scariest part of the matchup is turn 1. Mew is a deck that can get their Meloetta up and running when they go second with the Alessis Sparkle, and use Melodious Echo for 220 damage to knock out a Lugia pretty easily. And now, basically the whole point of the first turn is to make sure you can survive and play the game. It doesn't matter if you give up 2 prizes, all that matters is if you can play the game. Because if they come in and take the Melodious Echo knockout, you can go into your Lugia V-Star, take 1 prize on their Meloetta, and now they have to respond into the Lugia in kind, and it's very difficult for Mew to take that without using all of their modifiers at once. And if they do that, let's just say, you can go into your Yveltal now, which is an off-prize, 1 prize attacker, and put down a Tyranitar with a V-Guard at the same turn, because now Tyranitar cannot be one-shot because there's no more modifiers to work with. And you can take a knockout with Yveltal, and then Iono them, whatever, and then the game can be won off of just taking 2 knockouts from that point onwards, which is pretty easy to do because Mew's only attacker after that is Mew. So It's actually a very easy matchup as long as you can survive turn 1. Qianpao Baxcalibur is a deck that's the hot new flavor of the month, a very turbo-aggressive deck that focuses on using their Canceling Clone and Cross-Switcher Greninja combo to wipe out the board. The scariest part about the Qianpao matchup is one of the few decks that can match one-shots with you consistently, so that's pretty much where the matchup comes down to. Who gets the first knockout for 2 prizes, and who can start the arms race. Now what you can do as the Lugia player, if you feel comfortable when their board is wiped, is bring up something like the Baxcalibur if they only have 1, and take a knockout on that. However, if that doesn't pay off and they get another Candy Baxcalibur and wipe out another something like Lugia, you can do it again, boss up the Baxcalibur and take it out once more. The deck is so hinged on Baxcalibur, and they remove energies from their own board that you can kind of chase those big threats before dealing with their Qianpaos, because the Qianpaos, once they've attacked and removed energies off the board, they are really not a threat. They just kind of sit there, and they can get 2 energies with Shivery Chill, but if they can't accelerate them with Baxcalibur, what good do they do for the deck? That being said, this deck is hyper optimized to get Baxcalibur into play turn 2 and keep drawing cards with Bibarel, so Iono doesn't really affect them too much. It's just taking out the Baxcaliburs that's the most important part in this matchup. Gardevoir is one of the decks that is always going to be powerful for its entire lifetime, and probably the scariest matchup for Lugia to sit across the table from that isn't Miraidon. Gardevoir can draw a million cards a turn and do a ton of damage, and can play cards like Temple of Sinnoh that can really inhibit your setup. Now, in most situations, if you get to go first, you can take the first knockout always, and probably the second one as well into Gardevoir. However, if Gardevoir gets to go first, you'll get the first knockout, and there's a pretty good chance that on turn 2, they can get to their 8 energies with a Reversal Energy and Shining Arcana and take a knockout into your Lugia. Now, the follow-up response to that is either you knock out the active, or you can boss up the Gardevoir EX with an Yveltal and take a knockout there. You kind of have to preload your Yveltal because you need to use 2 Archeopsis effectively to set it up, so if you can at least put 2 single strikes on it early, you can preload the Yveltal and get it up and running. And then it becomes an arms race where you're trading 2 for 2 effectively, and if the Gardevoir player has to knock out your Yveltal, you're both at 3-3 prizes, which then puts you back in the lead because you can take 1 on their Gardevoir and you're left finding the boss for a game. However, if you are in a position where you have to use T-Tar, or they can find a boss on maybe your bench Lugia or bench T-Tar, the game gets difficult once again. That all being said, I think Gardevoir with Temple of Sinnoh is a little bit scarier because they can Iono and Sinnoh in the same turn, and you're left scrambling trying to figure out what my 2-card or 3-card hand can actually accomplish. One of the scarier matchups, but definitely winnable. I did beat 2 Gardevoir on my way to top 8 this weekend. Rapid Strike Urshifu is the final deck in our matchup roulette that I wanted to talk about. It's probably one of our most favorable matchups just because nothing in the Rapid Strike deck can actually one-shot anything in Lugia. They're going to go ahead and try to take out the Archeopsis on the bench, and the biggest thing you want to do is put 1 V-Guard on one of the Archeops, giving you a better matchup, because at that point, they can't Rapid Flow both Archeops in the same turn. Sure, they can Yoga Loop one of them, but they're not going to be able to deal with both at the same time, which is the most important thing. You can't give them an incredible tempo swing like that. Of course, they can use their Giacomo to kind of put you in a bad spot that way, but you have to make them find it while they're also finding all their other combo pieces to Yoga Loop in the same turn. They can't really punch through Lugias with V-Guards because you have a ton of health, and even if they're doing like 110 with Inteleon VMAX, you can just 2-shot their Inteleon VMAXs pretty easily, force them into using Cheryl, and you can keep healing with Radiant Serena pretty much every turn. So they're actually doing like 90 damage a turn, which is really, really low. Yeah, and you can just pivot between those attackers. Spiritomb is a little bit annoying in the early game because Spiritomb does make it so you have to find ways around using your Luminian for Burnett or like a supporter, so sometimes you could get stuck, and that's the one way you can lose this matchup. But all in all, I think this is one of our most favorable matchups as Lugia. If you guys enjoy this kind of content, competitive guides, whatever, let me know. Please like and subscribe. This channel is all about competitive content and making you a better player. So thank you so much, and I'll see you in a different video.